Now, more stories, insights, and analysis of Illinois policy and politics. This is Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Once again, your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with Jacob Huebert, senior attorney for the Liberty Justice Center, public interest law firm based in Chicago. And Jacob, Governor Rauner, and legislative Republicans have proposed the idea to essentially have a state takeover of the Chicago public school system since it can't seem to manage its finances, junk rated. Just this past week, their $875 billion bond issue, as we were talking about earlier, put on hold, $875 million bond issue, put on hold because the bond market spit it out, said, based on what we see going on in Chicago and at the state level, we're not too keen on this. CPS borrowing at a rate similar to Tanzania at this point. And so the question is this a good idea for CPS to consider to reorganize and try and reintroduce that school system into something that is salvageable and financeable?
Well, yeah. And, we liberty-minded types might be sometimes have reservations about a more centralized government coming in and telling a local entity what to do. But obviously, the local entity in this case has shown that it's not able to do the basic thing that it's expected to do in educating children. And at some point, somebody has to step in and act on behalf of those people who are captives of this system, who are forced to deal with it, and bring it under control. So it seems like under the dire circumstances in Chicago, it might make sense.
Yeah, and we've seen this happen in other places. Perhaps most notable recently is the city of Detroit. And for more on what happens in Michigan when local units of government can no longer manage themselves, we're now joined by James Hohman, who's a fiscal policy analyst at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and is an expert on Michigan's emergency manager law, such as was invoked for the city of Detroit. James, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
So to stick with the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and to impress you, I'm going to ask this question. Are we in the Overton window? Yeah. As it pertains to this idea of emergency managers for flailing local units of government.
The fact that you're talking about putting in an emergency manager policy in place, and it's a very real possibility, implies that it's well within the Overton window. Now, in other states, it might not be the case, but it really depends on the level of mismanagement the government has gone on and whether this idea is feasible or not.
And in Michigan, this emergency management has happened or has been used a number of times. Give us a case study, whether it's Detroit or another example that could be applicable to the Chicago public school system of how it would work if Michigan pursued something like this.
Yeah, so Michigan has had these laws in place since 1988, and even before then, the courts had appointed a receiver to manage local government when they were facing insolvency. So we have some experience. It's not always been successful, but where it's been best is where an emergency manager comes into a government, says, all right, here are our revenues, here are our expenses, and we're going to work really hard to make sure that those expenses keep going down while still maintaining service quality. And so one of the better examples has been in the city of Pontiac, which is a suburban city north of Detroit, where they worked with neighboring local governments to provide better services at lower cost for residents. They contracted out things like their golf course and tried to just manage their way out of this. That's only possible if there are savings to be had, and in mismanaged governments, there tend to be a lot of areas to save money while still maintaining services.
Is there any parallels to what you know about CPS, what we've described here, with respect to the Detroit public schools, which is not a particularly well-managed, quality educational system either?
Yeah, so Detroit Public Schools has been under emergency management for a long time now, and even before that, they were under an agreement with the state about how they were supposed to manage their finances, and so there's been a long history of mismanagement, and they're still unable to provide some of the basic answers that a lot of local governments and school districts are able to provide about their operations. But emergency managers have cut expenses, but Detroit has a substantial number of charter schools. In Michigan, we fund the schools based on how many students go there. And so as the charter schools have taken off in these urban environments, Detroit has just simply been unable to cut enough to stay afloat. And so that's what they're kind of dealing with right now, and they're looking for a bailout package. But I think, if there's going to be a bailout package, it has to be after this process where you do everything you can to cut your expenses before turning to the rest of the taxpayers.
What's the trigger? What's the threshold that you clear in Michigan to invoke the emergency manager and pursue this process? I mean, again, CPS, Chicago Public Schools here, $1 billion budget deficit this year, woefully underfunded teacher pensions that they can't keep pace with in terms of the annual contribution, and junk rated bond rating. Does that sound like something where if this was Michigan, it would be invoked?
So the bond rating I believe, is one of the triggers, but you got to realize that the emergency manager law is the last step in a long string of things to try and prevent insolvency. So, I mean, the first basic thing is just having a balanced budget requirement for your local governments. The next thing we do is that if these local governments do develop a budget deficit, they have to send a plan to the state treasury on how they're going to fix it. And then there's some assistance, there's some extra strings that come into place, but the last step that they have is that the state tells the local government, look, we gave you the rules, you told us you were going to fix it, you haven't done it, and you're approaching that point where you cannot pay your bills. We're going to send someone in charge. Now, those triggers can be things like 90 days. If the people that Chicago contracts with haven't been paid in the last 90 days and they're overdue, they can send a letter to the state to complain, and that's one of the triggers. If they don't turn in their financial reports on time, that's another trigger. And it sounds like junk, and I believe that having a low-rated general obligation bond would be one of the triggers.
How has the emergency management protocol in Michigan been received by the public, particularly the populaces that are directly affected when it's been invoked?
So for 20 years, it was around. They used it seldom. When the Snyder administration came and reformed the law, it started to develop some controversy. And now it's especially controversial because a lot of the major cities in Michigan were facing emergency management. So Flint is currently under management and is going through a human tragedy over its water department right now.
Right.
Of course, the city of Detroit, it's our largest city, it was facing insolvency. And former mayor was in prison. It was deeply mismanaged, and they went through bankruptcy through the emergency manager process. So it became more controversial. It still kind of is, but to the extent that it's controversial, it should only be controversial when they fail to do the job and resolve the fiscal crisis facing these governments. It shouldn't just be controversial because it's the state taking it over, because all local governments are creatures of the state. The state has to give them rules for which they have to live by, and if the local governments break the rules, there has to be consequences, and this is the most extreme of them.
Well, we hope to call our current mayor a former mayor who is in prison someday. James Hohman, he is the fiscal policy analyst at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. Thanks so much for joining us, James. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.